US President Joe Biden is under fire from elements of his own base over his handling of the Gaza crisis. Will that hinder his chances for re-election? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. The war in Gaza has raged for 6 months now, and many Americans are highly critical of the Biden administration's response. During primary contests, Democratic voters in some states marked uncommitted on ballots in a sign of protest against President Joe Biden. And that lack of support could possibly tilt the election in favor of former President Donald Trump. A recent poll by NPR PBS shows Trump leading Biden among young voters by about 2 points. Now, to try to regain that group, among other things, Biden announced an initiative to forgive student debt.
Starting this fall, we plan to deliver up to $20,000 in interest relief to over 20 million borrowers and full forgiveness for millions more.
There's a lot to talk about. Let's bring in our panel here in Washington, D.C. Eleanor Clift is a political columnist for The Daily Beast. Frank Sesno is Executive Director at George Washington University Alliance for a Sustainable Future and a former CNN Washington Bureau Chief. From Decatur in Georgia, Bill Crane is a political analyst, and Eric Bolling is host of The Balance at Newsmax. He joins us from Palm Beach in Florida. Thank you to all of you. Eleanor, let me start with you. Let's start talking about the situation in Gaza right now. It continues to influence voter opinion here in the United States. At this stage, according to the polls, it is Joe Biden who is losing support. Now, of course, elections are fought on many, many issues, but on this particular issue, could it actually decide the outcome of this election?
It could, but there are 6 months, and I think the president is making a number of efforts to persuade the Israeli prime minister to back off of the aggressive invasion war in northern Gaza, and he's getting some results. I mean, he's basically warning Mr. Netanyahu that if he continues to prosecute the war in a way that causes so many civilian casualties, that the U.S. will be attaching conditions to the weapons that we send to Israel. And the U.S. has voted with the Security Council to call for an immediate ceasefire. So President Biden has toughened up his rhetoric, both in public and behind the scenes. And a lot of the people who registered a protest want to see him act. They're not necessarily saying they're going to vote against him in November. And it's got to be made clear to them that if they vote for his opponent, they will get more of what they don't like, not less of what they don't like. So there's lots of education that has to be done, some adjustment of U.S. policy, which I think is in the works.
Right, Eleanor, as you say, he has toughened his position on the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but there are also questions being asked on the coherence of his policy. On the one hand, as you point out, he's toughened that against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, yet on the other hand, he continues to approve the sale of heavy weapons to Israel. That continues.
Well, there was a recent shipment. I don't know that there's another one in the works. And the president has threatened to withhold weapons if they, it doesn't seem to be any need for Israel right now to have these huge bombs in this rather small, congested area where the fight is being waged. So President Biden, he usually ends up with the right decision. Often it takes him too long to get there. But I think this is very much in the works, and we'll see how much leverage President Biden has over what Netanyahu does next. We'll see whether he has any sway. And I'm hoping that he does, for the sake of Israel as well as for the people in Gaza.
Frank, American elections are normally decided on domestic issues, things like the economy, pocketbook issues, as we sometimes hear. But here we have an issue, Gaza, which is a foreign policy issue, really, and it's having a great influence at this stage, at the campaign stage, on what could possibly the outcome, could change the outcome of the election in November. I mean, how much of a change is this?
How much of a change is it that we've got a foreign policy issue weighing in so closely? Well, it's not a big change really, because there are always foreign policy issues that explode, if I can use that term, just before an election. There are wars, there are conflicts. Usually, foreign policy issues focus the debate, but do not decide the election. Elections are decided based on the economy, domestic issues. We have a huge new development in the abortion issue today, where the Arizona Supreme Court essentially has ruled that all abortions need to be banned, except if the life of the woman is in danger, reverting to a 160-year-old provision. And that has already driven huge amounts of focus on that issue. President Biden has already announced that he's going to Arizona to highlight this. So while Gaza is an enormous issue, there are many others that are playing out. Where it matters is in very close states, states like Michigan, where there is a large Arab American voting population that is outraged about what is happening in Gaza and is not going to be placated by the president's assurances or gentle pressure or even outspoken pressure on Netanyahu. In some cases there, the damage is done. And the question is going to be, what happens in the region and what can Biden say, if anything, to win back or to hold on to the narrow margin of voters in that state that he needs to win in a very tough state. And the Arab American vote there is a critical part of that. So just to answer your question, while foreign policy issues are lightning rods for debate, they don't generally decide an election, but when things are this close, and especially in places like Michigan, where a voting bloc like that can be identified, it's very much in play.
So, Frank, in these swing states, when you have groups like Arab Americans, other minority groups as well, that are not happy with the way Biden has been responding to this crisis in Gaza, I mean, we've seen in the primaries that some of them have voted, or actually just listed uncommitted or uninstructed in the case of Wisconsin. I mean, can they tilt the election? And if this crisis continues, can that group actually get bigger and bigger?
Yes, and you cite Arab Americans, you cite other voters. Younger voters are another block of voters that the White House is watching very carefully and very warily, because they too are very upset about what has taken place in Gaza, and they have expressed that, and we see that in polls. And the problem that the president has in trying to win this back is, whatever he does with his rhetoric, on the one hand, you asked Eleanor about this a moment ago, if the weapons shipments, whatever the weapons shipments are, continue in an unimpeded way and there seems no consequence, that's not going to be very convincing. And in any case, much of the damage and destruction is done. And even if the war settles down, what's going to happen is journalists and others are going to go in, and then the narrative is going to shift not so much to an ongoing war, but the damage, the death, destruction, the suffering from it. So this story is not going away, and it's going to be very difficult for the president to talk voters who are personally affected or motivated by this to change their minds at this point, because this is just a horrible situation with political pressure points on all sides.
Bill Crane, Frank just mentioned one group of voters which will probably be a key part of any winning coalition, and that's young voters. And there was a poll that was done recently, which many found surprising, and that poll was conducted for NPR, PBS, Marist, and it showed that Trump is winning the younger vote, and a poll also done by Fox News showed that as well. What do you make of that?
Well, as we've discussed on your show and on for the last several months, we are unfortunately going to get a rematch that a lot of the nation would not like to see. And younger voters in particular look at a 81, soon to be 82-year-old Joe Biden and a 78, soon to be 79-year-old Donald Trump, and they cannot understand, starting just with that point, why we have these two men in this position in their lives, both of whom looking to have lost their edge. Donald Trump's energy levels seem to be stronger, but the messaging, the malaprops, the mistakes on the field, not knowing their spouse's names and other things cause a lot of discernment and question among young voters. But Trump also is sort of winning the propaganda war by kind of coming at it from the standpoint is he's fighting the system, he's fighting the swamp, he's fighting the deep state, which there's unfortunately a decent amount of buy-in among younger voters that it exists. But to the other issue you were speaking of a moment ago, foreign policy does win and decide elections when we're at war or when national security becomes the top concern, like after 9/11 in the presidential contest of 2004. So what we're seeing on play in Israel and in the Gaza is now expanding. We had an attack last week in Syria on an Iranian embassy, took out 13 Iranian military officials, including a senior general. Israel has not accepted responsibility, but it's generally agreed they conducted the attack. But the president of Iran and the military of Iran are saying that's not going to go unanswered, and they will strike not only Israeli, but American important targets in the Middle East, if not elsewhere. So as this escalates and this war maybe perhaps comes out of Gaza and goes into the other parts of the Middle East or other parts of the globe, then it completely could decide this election.
Eric, looking at this particular issue and its impact on the election, Donald Trump, of course, as we know from his time in the White House as well, he's one of Israel's biggest supporters. As he's campaigning now, his position on the election is that anyone who votes for Biden is someone that doesn't love Israel. So how do you see the issue playing out?
Well, I think we're forgetting that for the better part of 40 years, we've been great allies with Israel. Israel has been our greatest Middle Eastern ally, arguably our best ally, period. And for us to abandon Israel now, Eleanor says, stop sending them arms, don't send arms, don't trade arms with Israel going forward is insane. You're talking about wiping Israel off the map, which Iran wants to do. They'd like to do it to us too. So that would be ridiculous policy change. I agree with you, Arnon, that there is some question is what is our Israel policy right now? We're not really sure. When Biden leans into Bibi Netanyahu and says, stop doing what you're doing, or we're going to pull back our arms sales to you, that is a major Israel policy that I don't think anyone, either side of the aisle, is in favor of. Biden is in the middle because he doesn't know where to go. He realized backing Israel right now is likely will cost him Michigan because, as Frank Bill points out, Michigan has a heavy Muslim population. In fact, they were chanting death to America over the weekend from Dearborn, Michigan, because of what's going on in the Middle East. Biden's painted himself into a corner with Israel. He's painted himself into the corner with China and Taiwan. We don't know what's U.S. Taiwan policy right now. First, it was defend Taiwan at all costs. Then it was don't defend Taiwan at all. He's irresponsibly creating situations where the world doesn't know where we stand, and it's becoming more dangerous. Biden is now losing with young people. Biden is now losing with Hispanics in America. Biden is now losing 23% of the black vote to Trump. This is not boding well. And for him to try this disgusting display of vote buying by right now when the Supreme Court says, no, Biden, you're not allowed to forgive billions upon billions of dollars of student debt. And he does it anyway. All he's doing is trying to buy that young vote back, and we're going to expose it. And I think it's actually disgusting what he's doing.
Eleanor, it may look very gloomy for Joe Biden, but those polls I cited a moment ago, it's not all bad news if you look at some of those numbers. I mean, younger people may be supporting Trump in increasing numbers, but Biden is winning the older generation. And we know from previous elections that older voters go to the polls in much larger numbers than younger voters. So in the end, could it balance out for Biden?
Well, there are more young people than there are older people, I think. So, yeah, he needs to keep his coalition together. And in terms of the student debt, the president has put forward a responsible policy that's going to be challenged by the Republicans, but it is to forgive debt by people who borrowed money and have repaid the principal many, many times over in high interest rates that reward the banks. This is a good issue for the president in this sort of populist economic era that we are in. Secondly, I wanted to point out that there is some concern
the
with
millions of people who paid
administration
off their
that
student debt?
Netanyahu
One
is
moment, Eric.
spoiling for a wider war. But the White House needs to turn the conversation quickly to what happens next in Gaza. The two-state solution has been revived. You have Arab nations that weren't involved in the past, Qatar, the Emirates.
Yeah.
So I think this picture can change as dramatically as it did 6 months ago when Hamas had that
Right.
dreadful, atrocious acts in Israel.
Eric, your response very briefly, please, if you could.
Very quickly, what about the millions of people, millions upon millions of people who paid off their student debt? What about the people who didn't think they could afford college and went to trade school or just went to work instead, who are now getting student loan debt forgiven? It's completely unbalanced, unfair,
Yeah.
and to do it with 7 months before an election is vote buying at its ugliest form.
Okay, I want to get back to Bill Crane. Bill, I want to get back to an issue that Frank Sesno raised a moment ago, and that's the issue of abortion rights. Trump was pressed on the campaign trail about this issue. This was his opinion. This is how he responded. Let's watch.
My view is now that we have abortion where everybody wanted it from a legal standpoint, the states will determine by vote or legislation or perhaps both, and whatever they decide must be the law of the land, in this case, the law of the state.
So, Bill, here we have Trump now saying that it's a state's decision on abortion rights, yet Democrats say it is more likely that if Trump does get into office, he will support a federal ban. What's your view on this?
He's been getting into it with South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham, and so he's been kind of stepping into two different sides of this issue over the weekend. I don't believe President Trump wants a federal ban. I do believe he wants the conservative vote that comes with advocating it, but I don't believe that vote leaves him, and they're not going to go to Joe Biden. It was on his watch that the Supreme Court was put together largely by Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans that overturned Roe versus Wade, that looked at states' cases like Casey versus Pennsylvania and did, in effect, punt this choice back to the states. There are those in Washington, including the president, Joe Biden, who'd like to see a federal statute returning abortion rights. And there are Republicans who, like Lindsey Graham, would like to codify abortion up to 16 weeks. It will be an inflamed issue. It obviously plays importantly, particularly with suburban women. And depending on where we are in this discussion in the fall, it will be critical for Donald Trump in states like Georgia, where I'm sitting, where there's a massive amount of millions of urban, suburban women who will vote against whoever advocates full and total bans on abortion.
Frank, do you agree with that? I mean, you brought up the point earlier on with this ruling in Arizona, but how important it would be for both candidates to attract another important part of the winning coalition, women?
Oh, that's where the election is going to quite likely be decided. It's going to be a turnout election. Look, I think it's also important to observe that those polls that you cited earlier, the 2 percentage points by which Trump leads in many places, this is within the margin of error of these polls. This is essentially a dead heat contest right now. Lots can change. We're talking about a lot of it right here. But what the abortion issue is doing is it's driving right now, and we've seen it in all the test cases where there have been state votes since the Supreme Court ruled that the right to abortion was no longer guaranteed. Up till now, it's proven to be a massive turnout issue for people, especially those who, because they prevailed, want to protect rights to choose, rights to abortion. And if that happens in states like Arizona and Florida and others, it could toss up states one color or another, or make them very close. So this is a huge issue, and it's not going to just motivate women, but it's certainly going to motivate them and those younger voters we talked about earlier. Yeah. And you need your base and you need your voters to show up in order to win. So that's how Democrats are now using it, and they've sort of flipped the equation, because it had been for decades Republicans who were more effective at galvanizing voters around abortion. And now it seems to have changed. So we're in a very, very fluid, dynamic situation on this issue.
Eric, we are in a fluid situation, aren't we? Because how will conservatives see Trump's position? I mean, some are complaining that he's giving up the fight for he's giving up this fight on abortion rights for political gain. I mean, could he lose support on that?
So we've talked about this here on the show for years, literally years, about this, going back to when Trump was president. And it's a third rail for conservatives. But again, as Frank points out, they're not going to vote for Biden. Will they turn out for Trump? And will this impede them from turning out for Trump? I don't think so, because like we've said, the reason why Roe v. Wade was overturned is because Trump appointed 3 separate Supreme Court justices. Trump did what he had to do. It was the only answer. It's send it back to the states, let the states decide. It's the most logical one. It's almost like non-committal, and that's the best he's going to be able to do. I don't think it's going to sway the election. You know, you could say it may sway the election. I'm not sure it's going to have more of an impact than, let's say, immigration or crime, which seem to be bubbling up and being equally as important to the Republican voters, the conservative voters. I mean, maybe just what I think it's done, though, it's allowed down ticket races a little bit of leeway. Like Trump heads through the hole and says, you know what, send it back to the states. Carrie Lake, for example, went against the state's decision to ban abortion, and that allowed her to do that. She never would have done that yesterday had Trump not made that announcement.
Frank,
could I just say
you've got to respond. Go ahead.
To your point, though, this turns a hot button issue into a white hot button issue. And what's the first thing Biden has done? He's announced he's going to go to Arizona to make hay out of this. So the question is whether he can so anger and so motivate his voters who might otherwise sit this one out because they're not motivated by either of these candidates to show up. That's what this is. This is a show up issue.
I'd send Kamala Harris before I'd send the president on this issue.
Okay.
He's going.
Eleanor, I want to talk about something else that's been making a lot of news on the political pages these past weeks, and that is about fundraising. We saw President Biden, he was joined by former Presidents Obama and Clinton in New York. They raised a record sum of $26 million at an event in New York on a single night. Trump, though, is reported to have raised $50 million in just one night, and this is how the media in the United States responded to that. Let's watch.
It was a night for the record books for former President Trump.
Donald Trump raked in a record amount of money to add to his campaign war chest.
According to organizers, his campaign raked in a whopping $50 million.
Former President Trump setting a new fundraising record.
Last night, Mr. Trump framed this as a record-setting night.
As he gears up for what likely will be the most expensive presidential campaign in history.
So, Eleanor, for the outside world looking in, when they see these vast sums of money, I mean, isn't it worrying that any candidate requires these huge sums of money to get elected? And how does that impact sort of ordinary voters, people who live paycheck to paycheck? How do they see this?
A lot of ordinary voters are chipping in $5 and $10 every now and then to both of these campaigns, because there is a determination on each side, on the Democratic side, to make sure Donald Trump doesn't return to the White House, and on the Trump side to solidify the extraordinary hold he has on a lot of very ordinary people in this country. Look, it's a billion-dollar election. We've been getting there over the years. Each of these candidates will have enough money to spend, and I would ask how much of that money that Donald Trump is going to siphon off to pay for his legal bills. I mean, that is a legitimate question to ask, because one of the PACs that he's associated with has spent millions on his behalf. And I wanted to just add something on the abortion issue. By declaring his support for returning the issue to the states, he owns what just happened in Arizona with an 1864 law banning all abortion. He owns what's happening in his own home state in Florida, where a 6-week abortion ban goes into effect on May 1st. And every state where abortion has been on the ballot, the pro-reproductive rights side has won. So it's an enormous driver for the Democrats. And it's a clear choice that voters will have. Young voters, old voters, and everybody who understands what reproductive rights means in this country.
Frank, as Eleanor points out, Trump is using some of those campaign funds to pay for his considerable legal bills. So in a sense, doesn't Biden have the advantage there? I mean, he can spend his money on campaigning. Trump has to spend his money on paying legal bills as well as campaigning. He will be going to court next week on that hush money case in New York. Where do you see these legal challenges going in terms of where support for either candidate goes, or especially for Trump?
Well, especially for Trump, it's a great question, because I think there's been a lot of talk about the cases. There's been a lot of talk about the implications and the cost and all that. What happens when the trial actually gets underway? And day after day after day, there's testimony, and it'll be contested, and Trump will be there, and his base, and he will call foul that this is all politically motivated. But you've got real people talking to a real judge with a real jury of peers. And by the way, a lot of that jury will have been chosen by the Trump team as well, because that's how juries are chosen in this country. And so we just don't know. I mean, what happens if they go through the particulars of the Stormy Daniels, the porn star's story again, and the payoff, and what that got Trump out of? And you know, some of the witnesses are tainted witnesses. You know, Cohen, who was his lawyer, is going to be shredded, I'm sure, by the Trump team up there. But how this plays out day after day after day, we just don't know, because we've never seen anything remotely like this. This is unprecedented in American history.
Eric, we don't know how it's going to play out, but here we have a former president who's facing more than 90 charges, but he remains a very strong contender in this election. Does this, in a sense, tell us that voters are seeing these legal challenges in a very different way? They're seeing it as more political than legal.
And not only voters are, independent voters are. And the reason why I say this is he's leading. You know, we cited some polls, but what we failed to cite was there have been two most recent swing state, battleground state polls where Trump is winning. One of them all 7, one of them 6 of 7. Most of them outside the margin of error. So what it tells you is independent voters are saying, you know what, all these prosecutions, these Fannie Willis's, who she's a terrible example of a prosecutor, or Alvin Bragg, who can't keep crime down in New York City, but wants to bring charges against Trump for things that people say are charges. The point is this: most Americans, not Republicans, most Americans feel, yeah, he's up for a lot of charges, but most of them seem like they're biased against him. And it feels like you wouldn't want your average American exposed to that type of lawfare. So they're actually backing the guy they might not even like, just because he's been done in injustice.
Okay, we have to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.